All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Entangled Political Economy Research Network's virtual seminar series. We are joined today by André Quintas, I believe is close enough.
Yeah, it's close enough.
Perfect. I'll redub it later when I get a correct pronunciation and edit this one. But he is going to be giving his presentation on his working paper right now. And so with that, I want to throw it over to Andre and thank him so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and for everyone to be here. I'm very happy to share this paper with everyone and to receive feedback. It's always an amazing opportunity, especially in this setting, I would say. And so this paper is titled "Competing Visions of Cronyism" within the Virginia School of Political Economy. Is co-authored with Peter Boettke. And so let's jump straight to the paper, right? So on January 2025, President Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States of America. Among the many striking features of that ceremony, one stood out as emblematic of a deeper structural reality: the presence of the tech bros. Standing behind President Trump were Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and of course, Elon Musk. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. That image represented better than any paper, any book, the political reality that we are living today, the entanglement between the political and economic elite. That picture represented what classical liberals feared for centuries and what public choice scholars have tried to explain since the beginning of the field. And of course, this reality have led many on the political left to blame capitalism. For them is the proof that capitalism failed. Here we have Bernie Sanders, where he says, we live in a democracy, but they own that democracy. They spend tens of billions of dollars on campaign contributions to buy politicians who will do their bidding. That is why over the last 50 years, we have consistently seen public policy that benefits the very rich at the expense of everyone else. So for Sanders, the root cause is very clear: capitalism. It is because of capitalism that we have this unbalance in power and that the political and economic elite govern over the masses. And of course, these critiques are not new. Since the beginning of the commercial society, we have seen thinkers criticizing capitalism on those grounds. Rousseau said that the markets bring the worst out of human nature, it incentivizes greediness. Karl Marx and Engels, of course, said that markets concentrate power in the hands of the elite, in this case of the bourgeoisie. And so across time, the fear is the same. Markets empower the few at the expense of the many. What is interesting about all this is that these critiques are shared by many of the strong supporters of capitalism. We have Adam Smith and Hayek, for example, where Smith, for example, says that describes the wealth of nations as a very violent attack I had made upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. A system that he saw riddled with privilege, with monopoly, and where the political connected had an advantage over the rest. A century and a half later, Hayek would echo these concerns, saying the essence of the liberal position, however, is the denial of all privilege. And so we find ourselves in a very strange moment in time where the critics of capitalism and the defenders of the capitalism start sounding alike. They both criticize privilege, they both criticize monopolies, and they both criticize the entanglement between the political and economic elite. And so when two sides attack the same disease, we have to ask, what system are they talking about then? And so that puzzle is what motivates this paper. What is the nature of the current political system? And if not capitalism, what is the relationship of this system with capitalism? To understand that, we turn to the tools developed by the Virginia political economy scholars over the time. But more specifically, we look at the Randall Holcombe framework, political capitalism, and Professor Wagner entangled political economy framework. Here, I should say that it's an interpretation of Professor Wagner entangled political framework because, to our knowledge, he doesn't specifically or directly address cronyism, but we believe that the way we are interpreting this framework is very helpful in understanding cronyism. And so what we are going to see is that even though they both share the diagnosis that this system is better described as cronyism and not capitalism, their origin story is different. And this origin story matters for one, to better describe the system we live in, but also to understand how we arrive here and how, if at all, can we get out of here. Just to give a little bit of what is coming ahead, for Randall Holcombe, it's a degeneration story. Capitalism starts relatively clean and gets distorted along the way. So cronyism from this perspective is an analytical endpoint. For Professor Wagner, it's cronyism is the analytical starting point. So the cronyism is the baseline, if we want. Before we go to these two frameworks, let me just go over a little bit of the Virginia School Political Economy milestones, theoretical milestones that will be very familiar to everyone here. So I'll go a little bit quick here, but are important to see how exactly we arrive at the two frameworks that I'm going to talk about later. The first theoretical milestone is indeed the creation of the field of public choice, right? So the idea of applying economic tools and economic reasoning to understanding politics and political systems. Then, of course, with Buchanan, we have the idea of analyzing politics without romance, meaning that the same individual that is self-interested in the market is the same self-interested individual that acts in the political realm. So it is incentives that guide people, not morals, or not primarily morals. We should look at incentives to see how people will act or why people act the way they are. Then we have Tullock, rent seeking, everyone knows, but here is important to talk about the transitional gains trap, right? So Tullock noticed that the first movers benefit from the privilege, from the monopoly privilege, but after that, those gains are capitalized into the asset, and so they don't have extra profit since from there onwards. But they still have to keep lobbying because getting rid of that monopoly, if they lose that monopoly power, that will impose a cost on them. And so they are trapped. They have to keep lobbying, not to make extra profit, but to avoid losses. All these developments, they are very helpful. They were very helpful in understanding the political system. However, we can see here that is very much focused on the demand side of rents, the rents, on the behaviors of the rent seekers, right? What this point, what raises is the question of why will political actors even engage in this process, right? What are the incentives of politicians to create rents and allocate those rents? So in other words, is the supply side that is missing in this story. And that gap starts being filled by McChesney with the rent extraction story, where he notes that politicians are not really naive or some actors that are corrupt in a naive way and are not passive in this process. They are very active. In fact, they engage in regulatory threat, in ambiguity and creating uncertainty to make sure that private firms will engage in lobbying in a defensive way. So this was very cool. We have now a story of the demand side and the story of the supply side of rent seeking, but it's still very much fragmented. We still don't have the framework story that will later come. Eklund and Tollefson apply the rent seeking tools to analyze a particular story age in time, the mercantilist era. Again, very helpful, but still not the systematic approach that will only arrive with Holcombe and Wagner. And so that was the background or the theoretical developments that happen and where Professor Wagner and Randall Holcombe emerge with their theoretical framework. Again, this is all an interpretation of it, but it seems, yeah. Okay, so Randall Holcombe. Again, everyone here is familiar with Professor Holcombe's work, a leading figure in VPE. And among the many topics that interest Professor Holcombe, one stands out: power dynamics, the study of power. And in his political capitalism book, he really tries to understand how power is made, political power is made and maintained. And he defines their political capitalism as a system where the political and economic elite writes the rule of the game to their own benefit at the expense of the masses. And again, as I mentioned before, a big chunk of Holcomb's contribution, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative way, it's a big contribution, was to put all the pieces together that were already being developed in the public choice literature. For example, Professor Holcomb notes that Stigler talks about how regulation favors the regulated industries, but he fails to note that the regulators themselves benefit from that process. Going back to the transitional gap trap that Tolok talks about, Tolok attributes that trap to policy decision-making error, not deliberate created. And McChesney talks about rent extraction, but fails to connect back with Tolok transitional trap. It's only because private firms are in this trap that they are more that we can engage in this rent extraction process. And so it is this connection of the dots that Professor Holcomb does that generates this framework of political capitalism. But it doesn't stop there, of course. One big thing that Professor Holcomb did was to give the micro foundations for something that sociologists have noted for centuries, that elites rule over the masses. But Professor Holcomb, with the causing theory and the transaction cost dynamics, will say that the elites are able to influence policy decision making precisely because they belong to the low transaction cost group. So they can organize themselves better, they can mobilize themselves better. Whereas the masses are the high transaction cost group. So they have high coordination costs, they cannot mobilize themselves, and so they are more passive in this decision making process. What happens as a result is that elites are able to influence heavily the decision-making process, whereas the masses are essentially disenfranchised from the process. So the idea that people rule in a democratic setting is a myth. But it's not only that. In Following Their Leaders, the new book, Professor Holcomb goes one step further. It's not only that people don't have a say, even when they have a say, because the preference that they have are not really their own, there are whatever preference the elites happen to have, they will only reinforce that power elite and legitimize that power elite. So that's even a deeper criticism of current democratic settings. People don't have a say because of these transaction cost dynamics, but when they say because people don't have really political preference, they pick whatever preference the elite have, they will only reinforce that power elite. So instead of the voting ballot being a check on that elite, is a moment where that power is reinforced. So that's more or less the dynamics of the system for Randall Holcomb. But in a recent paper, he really talks about how this system of crony capitalism emerges within capitalist dynamics. He distinguished between two groups in capitalism: the getting ahead and the staying ahead group. The getting ahead is everything that we think about positively about capitalism, right? So innovation, creativity, everything that benefits the consumers, new products, new service, all that is positive about capitalism. And so by trying to serve the consumers with new products, what happens is that this triggers a reaction because, of course, by bringing new products to the market, you render the other products obsolete. And by attracting consumers to you, you attract consumers away from the incumbents. And so this triggers a reaction from the incumbents, from the staying ahead group, the companies that are already, that have a big market share in this market. And so they will try to protect themselves from this competition. They can try to protect themselves by competing in the market, but if the state is really a presence in the economy, it's more likely that they will try to use political influence to protect themselves, to shield themselves from competition. And so these dynamics, coupled with a larger portion, like a more an increase in the state intervention in the economy, gradually shifts the incentives of the system to go from market competition to political competition. Okay, so here the story that I presented here of Professor Holcomb really is a story of degeneration. Capitalism turns into something else. In the case political capitalism, Professor Holcomb label, but here we say cronyism. It is important to keep in mind now that we turn to Professor Wagner framework. We extend a Richard Wagner entangled political economy framework to suggest a more unsettling possibility. Cronyism is not a feature, is a feature, sorry, not a bug. From the natural state to current democratic societies, whenever you have individuals, political actors, or economic actors interacting, coalitions will be formed and privilege will be exchanged. And Professor Wagner framework explains why. Politics is a peculiar business. Professor Wagner really changes the way we do political economy. He distinguishes between two approaches: the additive political economy and the entangled political economy. These will be familiar to everyone here, but I'll go over it because it's important to see how the argument develops. Additive political economy is the standard way of doing political economy. We have the state and we have the market. The state seen as a unitary actor, a unified actor, intervenes into the market. But Professor Wagner thinks this is a misleading way of seeing the issue because state actors and market actors really are co-located. They exist in the same order, right? So CEOs, bureaucrats, private firms, governmental agencies, they are players within the same game. Professor Wagner is going to say, yes, indeed, exchange exists in the market, exists also in the political realm. But politics is really a peculiar type of business. What is so peculiar about it is that market exchange are dyadic. It's between voluntary transaction between two individuals or two parties, whereas political exchange is triadic, where most of the times a coalition is formed to impose the will of the majority on the minority. Another thing that Professor Wagner really is going to do is to change the way we think about the state. Again, we usually think of the state as a unified actor, but truly the state is composed of many organizations where power and knowledge is distributed, and more important, conflict and cooperation coexist. And so when we see a policy outcome, we should not be thinking as these as a result of a unified plan, but really as a result of all these interactions of all these people that have different incentives, different goals, and importantly, different levels of knowledge. And so when we talk about speaking of the state is as meaningless as to speak of the market. Only individuals act. And so the market and the state are really emergent orders. And here, again, another interpretation, but we believe that these will lead Professor Wagner to depart from the conventional treatment of interventionism, Aikida, Mises, and all these scholars. Why? As you know, the dynamics of interventionism is a unidirectional type of thing, right? So from the state to the market. Another aspect of the dynamics of interventionism is that predict a lot of instability in this system because of unintended consequences and all that. But Professor Wagner, our interpretation seems to go against this view. For one, as I already hinted before, it's a bidirectional type of thing. Indeed, from the state to the market, but also from the market to the state. And as Professor Wagner says, we should talk about participation, not intervention. I really love this point about the participation, by the way. I think it really captures something important. The second aspect of this is that we should not overestimate the amount of instability in the system. Why? Because the elites, they have interest in maintaining the system relatively stable. They don't want the system to collapse because they want to extract resources. And so the instability story of the dynamics of intervention might be a little bit overstated. And so another thing that Professor Wagner also changes in the way that we see the state, and I kind of already mentioned this before. It's the idea that we should see not the market and the state an aggregate level interacting, but really people that happen to be performing a role as a state actor or a market actor interacting. And so why is this important? Because when we talk about capitalism or socialism or every political economic system that emerges, we should not see this as a top-down imposition. This really is an emergent order. And so in the case of cronyism, there is no master plan to impose cronyism. There is no big conspiracy theory to impose a cronyist system. It's an order. It's formed from the interaction of the individuals. And so it's not a distortion of an order, it's an order of itself. So that's the main takeaway of this story. Now, you might ask, okay, it's an emergent order. It's in a sense the baseline. But can we do anything to kind of curb these crony dynamics? And one thing that you might think that is a solution will be, okay, democratic control. Why not? Give people power and maybe they will check on the power elite. And Professor Wagner will say that not only that doesn't work, but also exacerbates that very problem that is purported to solve. Why? The fundamental reason is that democracy has two rhetorical devices that legitimize the power elite: the idea of the social contract and the idea of the general will. And so when people go to the voting ballot, they have the sense that they are in power, but there is a difference between voting and the actual policies that happen. And so the most perverse aspect of democracy is that other systems really rely on force to make sure that the people are governed. But democratic settings, they are more persuasive. They try to make people consent, and so they give people the impression that they have a say, but in fact they truly don't have. And so Professor Wagner goes as far as to say that despite the fact that feudalism and democracy look very different, at the fundamental level, they share this dynamic that is there is an elite that rule over the masses. So all in all, they are not as different as you might otherwise think. That's the takeaway here. Okay, so what are the implications of all this story? Um, so if our interpretation of Professor Wagner is correct, this really flips the history of cronyism and of capitalism on its head. So the usual story is that the market started relatively clean and efficient, and along the way, privilege crept in and capitalism got distorted. But Professor Wagner's framework really suggests the opposite. It's not that capitalism degenerates into cronyism. Capitalism, if anything, was always the force that tried to escape cronyism grip. Cronyism is not a distortion, is a default. It is capitalism that is the anomaly. And so capitalism should not be seen as a corrupting force, but as an emancipatory force. And we believe that this has two big implications for how we see things. The first one is in terms of economic history, right? So the history of capitalism and particularly the history of the great enrichment that should be seen as a hard-won victory over cronyism. This is a thing that shouldn't have happened. How was it that we were able, for a brief moment in time, to put elites in check and have the tremendous growth that we had? And related to this, maybe we are not witnessing now a crisis of capitalism. Maybe we are just seeing a return to the baseline where cronyism and the crony dynamics that were always there for all history are reclaiming, in a sense, territory that was since always them, in a sense. The second aspect is that it also changes the way we talk about comparative systems. So we usually talk about capitalism versus socialism, capitalism versus communism, capitalism versus feudalism, so on and so forth. But truly, if we read Professor Wagner right, what this means is that we shouldn't get to give too much power to these labels, because these labels mask a fundamental dynamic that is in all of them, that is this entanglement between the political and economic elite. There is one anomaly that is capitalism, and there is one rule, cronyism. Thank you very much. Uh, sorry, I see Professor Wagner here.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks so much, Andre. That was an excellent conversation. With that, I'm going to open up the Q&A and we'll go straight to Richard Wagner.
Well, first of all, I congratulate you, Andre, for a wonderful presentation, summarization, and so forth. I think you and
Thank you very
Professor
much.
Boettke together have a wonderful project going forward. There are several things that I was motivated to bring up, in the context of what you had to say and the project as I interpret it going forward, that I think, again, as I said, is wonderful. Um, I think behind all of this raises a vital question. See, one huge problem with modern economics is its thinkers are all heavily materialistic, philosophically speaking, not necessarily Marxist, but but materialist to be sure. The all essence of social living together is reduced to the stuff and the things that people have. Uh, I'm deep down wanting to revert to more of a philosophically idealist framework of thinking where the important things are the moral attitudes, the ideas that we hold in our heads and that bind us together. And if I go that route, that takes me far away from modern economics, way back to the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, and all of those characters. And you mentioned on, I noticed that on page 15 of your paper, you had a brief remark about my disgruntlement with the idea of a social contract.
Yes.
I think it's a huge misguided fiction.
Yes.
See, why does the social contract come into economic discourse and political philosophical discourse? Because that discourse has evolved, I would say, in a stupid way. So how can you get kind of, because we all sense we live in an orderly society more or less, but that orderly doesn't mean without rancor. That's all there. That's all part of the human living together. So where does that, where does that orderly come when you have modern schemes of thought where the key feature of that thinking is the reduction of everyone and their differences to some duplicate of one another. And so then we pose, well, okay, we've all agreed to this stuff that governments are doing. It's all a giant social contract. Well, that's just BS. If
Yeah.
we look in terms of the history of thought, all those Scots, they all face the questions. First of all, the Scots began from some concept of human nature. Now, human nature was a complex variable. It wasn't a simple thing. You couldn't reduce human nature to maximizing wealth, maximizing utility, maximizing anything. It was a complex jumble of a variable. Like, I don't know if none of you may be as much of a football fan as I am, or less professional these days. I've gotten tired of that, but I still follow the college, although that's getting more professional like. But I've been uh, very interested in the Mississippi coach, and you know he's he's got this intense bidding among three universities now for his services, and he himself refuses to reduce that to net present value maximization
Okay.
because he also, I know a little bit about his personal circumstances, not much, but he's got a problem, traces back to a separation at one time from his wife and his children, and they've come back together. And I can appreciate the difficulties of all that because if you want to see, modern modes of explanation insist on making everything in life a matter of simple maximum calculation.
Yeah.
And, I think if we all reflect upon, oh, you all lives are too short compared to mine, but if you reflect on backwards, there's all kinds of things where if you, in the moment, you're there, it's not simple calculation quite often.
Right.
After the fact, you always have to make sense of what you did. And the easiest way of making sense is to retrodict that into a maximization problem solved. But if you go back to those Scots, they started, their basic challenge was they recognized that societies were relatively orderly. You could live in society amongst other people. And they sought for a way of trying to understand how that was all possible in terms of such things as, well, people wanted, on the one hand, wanted to be well regarded and well received by their fellows. That brought up such concepts of approbation and so forth as orderly processes. There was a recognition among all of them that
Right.
a royal family could not make order. It was the people themselves that made the order, but they also recognized that, sure, that human nature also had space for jealousy, envy, desires to be number one and not number two. Who wants to be second violin when you could be first violin? All this sort of stuff. I mean, that, if you ask the kind of question of what is organized humanity capable?
Right.
Well, if, the modern economist looks to a welfare function to optimize something. Donald Trump, the giant optimizer, or some such thing. I love that opening picture you had of Trump and all these billionaire tycoons.
Yeah.
But,
Here.
yeah, that one. Three of the richest people in the world and the president who
Yeah.
aspires to be one of them. And that is in terms of organized humanity, and that our natures, how to achieve good living together in close geographical proximity,
Yeah.
is not a simple question to answer. And so that was the Scottish tradition. And I think economics went totally off the rails with the advent of starting off with Leo Walras and going forward into modern equilibrium theory, and all of this reduced the economic problem to one of lining the ducks up rightly to optimize, that had the effect, I would submit, of treating some image of a ruler as a welfare function to maximize the value of a set of cattle, first to be fed at expense and then taken to market to be slaughtered. And that totally subverts any kind of humane quality to economic analysis, which is why I think modern economics is deeply, fundamentally inhumane at its core. And so that, let me give you one further illustration of this, two further illustrations, then I'll stop. In terms of, so, my basic overall theme in which my work, your work, entangled network work, all this is, we're all, I think, trying to figure out how to think our way through the situations in which we find ourselves, in recognition that what our opportunities are, what our challenges are, fundamentally depend upon the kinds of tools for thinking we have. That is, there's a wonderful book, a woman named Mary Morgan, written about 10 years ago, called
The World in a Model? Yeah.
yeah, Mary Morgan, The World in the Model, I think
Yeah.
was the title, and
Yes, it
the
is.
subtitle is something like How Economists Think. That was her effort at a history of economics. And the point there is that if you look at the Scots and economics at that in their time, the people had natures. Those natures did not lead to single valued calculations. Wealth was present, sure. Love, friendship, envy, hate, dislike, all of that. That's all part of us.
Yep.
Now, how do some of those things manifest and come into the foreground? Some get repressed. Well, that's all a matter of the kinds of interactions and interrelationships that come into play and are released by different, you might say, different kinds of schemes of governance. And then if you go from like Smith's, Ferguson's, and so forth time, uh, by decade into the late 19th century, you get such things as Alfred Marshall in the 1860s wanting to abolish economics as a field of moral philosophy and make it an independent science of its own that he thought would give it more pizzazz by being scientific, statistical, and so forth. Then you get Leon Walras, and it just gets worse and worse ever thereafter, I would submit. That you get to Frank Knight, and I'll say one thing about Frank Knight and then another about a man named Harold Berman and stop. Frank Knight uh, in 1921 publishes Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. That book was written as his doctoral dissertation in the 19 teens, which was, that was a time when neoclassical economists were debating such things as the usefulness of aggregate production functions.
Mm-hmm.
That there was the idea that if all economic production took place according to a linear homogeneous production function,
Right.
then everyone would receive their just desserts because the property of, at least within a competitive system, the property of a competitive system being then that everyone receives as payments from the market the value equivalent that they contributed as producers to the market. And so that was such a nice, neat thing. And then some people would ask, but isn't it kind of fatuous to posit one production function for the entire nation, world, or whatever you're talking about?
Yeah.
And then the answer would be, but if the data fits, it must be okay. Those kind of debates have always are always there.
Yeah.
But when you get so you've embraced the reductionism that leads to the modern theoretical apparatus, then you have to work your way from there. But if you didn't do that, if you're back in the classical world of Smith, Ferguson, and so forth, then you get to Frank Knight. There's risk, uncertainty, and profit was divided into two parts: theory of perfect competition, theory of imperfect competition. Now, for Knight, the whole world was always invariably and necessarily imperfectly competitive. Perfect competition was just a fable. Now, by a fable, Knight meant the same derivation as utopia meant. Now, if you look at the language, in the original Latin, utopia comes from topos. You in Latin meant a negation. There was no such thing. It wasn't. Now, I know there are some theologians, I know I've read a few of those guys who write, like Karl Barth once started a book with a chapter on nothingness that said the first thing to be known is nothingness is not nothing. But that kind of blew my mind to start. But utopos, no such place. It's just a fable to make us kind of feel good. But it wasn't any place you could ever live in or get to. So the whole world was imperfectly competitive. But the virtue of a liberal type social organization is that wherever you were, each of you, each of everyone, wherever you are, you're not locked into that. You have options because your life is always your life to create. As I like to say, we all have the liberty to construct our autobiographies. We're not chained to someone else's plan. We might choose to do so, we might not choose to do so. So it's up to us. That's what liberty fundamentally is about. And so within a liberal scheme of political economy, you find that you don't like where you are, what you're doing. You can, number one, change jobs. Number two, start a new business.
Yep.
Those are both things you can do. They're open to everyone. Now, you may have to use some ingenuity on how to go about doing that. Nothing is costless in this world after all. And but also it means at the same time, when you bring in democratic processes, it means that political figures likewise can engage in the same type of activity, because if you have competitive democratic processes, that politicians, in competing to acquire power or to hold power in a democratic system, have to enlist other people as supporters, both as financiers, because campaigning is costly, and as voters, because in a democracy you have to acquire votes.
Right.
Which means, in going back in Holcomb's case and so forth, in one of your latter slides, that then what you're going to find is that people who have been successful in their own commercial efforts are going to reasonably invest in supporting political efforts to support them while appearing to do something else.
Right.
And then one last thing, and I'll say that I'm taking too much time, but then I'll stop, is something I'd recommend to all of you is a book by a lawyer named Harold Berman from 1983 called Law and Revolution. And that's a big book. It's like a 500-page book. But what Berman did there was look at the assembly of the whole Western liberal tradition, legal tradition. He dated it, the initiation of it, from around 1100 AD, and how that a common legal tradition spread throughout the Western world up until he stopped his narrative at 1900. And he closed the book by saying he stopped it there because it was at that point that he began to see signs that that tradition was beginning to erode. And I think if you follow it through, you would see 80 or so years of erosion of that tradition taking place. Not, it's not gone by me, certainly, but and these things don't happen instantaneously like that. But it's not something you can see in terms of static equilibrium types of models. It's also not something you can see by statistics of any type. If you ever looked at that Nassim Taleb book, which I recommend wholly to you, I forget the title of the book right this minute. That's, but uh,
The Black Swan?
yeah, the Black Swan, the Black Swan. Uh, Somewhere in there, he was telling a tale of a turkey before
Oh,
Thanksgiving, and he had a time series. Imagine time series of the turkey's weight over 1,000 days. And it was, little jiggles as time series would up and up and up. And so you got to the day before Thanksgiving. And so if you were a pure inductivist statistician, you would probably be inclined to keep growing the turkey.
oh,
But little did the turkey know that he was going to have his neck wrung the very next day. And so that, in terms of the Western legal tradition, that the growth of liberty has requirements on individuals because, in commercial activity, uh, conflicts, disputes are always going to arise. They're inescapable. We are all capable of having our feeling that our partners haven't done just by us or so forth. And that the basic idea of a competitive equilibrium, everyone receiving just desserts, is a fiction of an aggregate production function. But for actual processes, that this is a never ending kind of conflict that I'm hereby suggesting that the best avenue into that approach is not to go back to Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson, but to recognize that the reductionism that has taken all humanity out of individuals and reduced them to data, that is a sign point of modern economics, has an escape route, which resides in ideas of complexity, computational economics, agent-based computational modeling, and things like this, which all those platforms have the feature that the aggregate level phenomena are emergent products of interactions among individuals within some some kind of framework that has been developed by them as well. And I think this picture you have here in front of us, I think, is a revolting kind of feature of where one possible outcome of democracy. It's not the, in the close of the American Constitutional Convention, there's that famous statement of when Benjamin Franklin was asked, what kind of constitution did you folks create?
yeah.
And he responded, a republic, if you can keep it. Now, but so I think all this entanglement puts on some very important questions of constitutionalism. It doesn't say democracy is bad or good or anything like that. It says that there are far more nuances, like all modern political discourse is two-dimensional in the sense that everything relates one contemporary event to another.
Right.
Whereas what we need are the classic, so the Scots were three-dimensional thinkers,
Right.
in that there were the events that were going on around them at the present time. And also there was the processing of this by the individuals themselves that have layers of activity connecting both their pasts and other people. And that, I think there's a whole avenue, a whole realm of rethinking of how do we go about undertaking social science, social inquiry, where we all have natures. Those natures, though, are complex variables, not simple variables, and that we all as individuals differ in our interest, in our abilities, in our talents. Uh, there's also, and so forth, and that is something, a scheme of thought for that is very different than a scheme of thought where someone wants to construct an ability to generate ideological representations that justify governance. These four down here. You can develop welfare economics offers one way of justifying this as doing good for us. Uh, but that's not self-governance.
No.
And so anyway, again, congratulations on a wonderful paper, and I hope to see much more of the work you and the two of you and everyone else interested in entangled political economy bring forward. Thank you.
No, I thank you for all your work and for being such an inspiration to my work. And it's a great pleasure to be here presenting this paper to you, and a great challenge, I should say, because interpreting someone's work to that person, it's always very challenging. And thanks a lot also for all the reference and the books that you suggested. I'll be sure to look them up. But if I may, I don't know, may I ask a question to Professor Wagner? Yeah. If I may ask a question. How do you see the fate of the Western democracies going forward? Because I don't know if I'm being accurate here, but one thing that I think is something present in your books and in your work is some kind of a pessimistic view on democracy, right? Or not to say that democracy is bad. No, I'm not saying that, but like there is some kind of pessimism about democratic governance and all that. And so, how do you see going forward? Yeah, the democratic fate. How do you think this is going to end, or like what's the next things happening for Western democracies?
No, I do not feel pessimistic about the future. I feel that the future is always yet to be made, and that the making of that future is always going to involve contestation.
Sure.
And that that contestation, moreover, is not purely a rationalistic kind of activity. We are only in part rational creatures. We have feelings. We respond to images. Part of the contestation resides in the construction of images. Again, I find this is a revolting image, but maybe not everyone would. But so that means the future is yet to be made. Now, it doesn't mean that just because you want to wiggle your nose, you're not going to get what you want. Uh, but that's not life. We shouldn't expect that to happen, and we don't. And so I'm not pessimistic, but I don't at all think that, well, you know, I think, for instance, that the democratic form we had in this country back when Berman was assembling his law and revolution, or 1789, was better. But you go back to that, don't forget, though, that at the time of when Ben Franklin gave his statement about a republic if you can keep it, that Constitution was the outcome of some intense competition among people, very thoughtful people, who were defined as anti-federalists.
Mhm.
The people like Jefferson, Hamilton, all that were called Federalists. Then the anti-Federalists were people who opposed ratification of the American Constitution and wanted to continue living under what at that time was the Articles of Confederation, and of which a wonderful 7-volume compilation was made by Herbert Storing of the complete anti-federalists. And it was a very close, intense debate. I mean, it took 2 years or so to convince enough people to get 9 states to ratify the Constitution, and the rest came later. So
Yeah.
if you allow yourself to live inside that period, 1784, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so forth, what you find there, living in there, you have a sense of, gee, what's going to happen here? Are we? I mean, it's where if you get out of that and look back, it's done. So, so much of our constitutional dialogue seems to create a kind of a calm, settled sense when if you're living in the moment, it's not. And that's what we're all engaged in. And that's why I think the kinds of tools we have to shape our thinking, I think this conjunction of some of the Scottish Enlightenment ideas with modern kinds of computational complexity theory techniques, I think can offer insight into how to shape economic, political economy discourse in a far superior way than what modern economics is doing. And I'll bet you, I think there's a whole lot of people out there who, most economists, don't forget, want to make a living. This is a fact of life. It's a fact of you, me, all of us. We need to get on in life. And here we're all in some kind of minority set of people. And I bet you there's a good part of that majority who looks to like to massage data for what they do and so forth and maximizing functions, who I've talked to some of these people, after all, and who say, yeah, this is kind of a dubious, maybe even pile of shit sometimes, but I don't know what else to do. And I'm trained at doing this. And yet, I bet you I can see, even at my age, I can see ways of pursuing some of these insights in a present context that gives a better understanding of genuine self-governance rather than this kind of governance depicted down here.
Thank you.
But that's up for all of us, and especially all of you looking forward.
Thank you, Professor Wagner.
In no means, it's not simple, but it's challenging. Maybe not as challenging as mountain climbing 20,000 feet in the air and so forth, but yeah.
Thank you.
Let's go to Nils.
Yeah, thank you, Andre. I like your paper, your presentation. Still, I wonder, or maybe you could just tell me what you think about it. I would be interesting in two more things. So, I mean, your story is okay. There are some ideas about rent seeking, then it evolves into these broader Visions of Cronyism by Professor Wagner and Holcombe, and then you have these nice distinction. So to two things I would be interested in your opinion. The one thing is, I mean, the most of the history or like the theory of rent seeking by Buchanan and Menko Olson and others, you would more put them in the Holcombe frame, right? That's the one question I have. And the second would be,
I lost you for a little bit. I don't know if it's my internet.
okay.
Can you repeat?
The first question is if how would you put all these kind of um, the earlier thinkers about and authors about rent seeking and cronyism like Buchanan, Make Your Own
Uh-huh.
Tullock,
Got you.
would you put them in into their more or less Holcombe frame and vision? And then the second one is what do we learn about that? I mean, in your paper you write that as far as I got it, Holcomb and Wagner both come up maybe to the same conclusions in the end. That, but still, could you help me a little bit? What can we learn from these visions concretely? How can we change our institutions to fight cronyism? Does it make any difference if we now have with the reverse first cronyism, then capitalism? Does it has any implications for doing policy and having institutions to fight cronyism?
Right, nice. Very, very good questions, really. And of course, I thought about that when we were doing the paper. And here, of course, all my answers will be mine, not from Professor Pete Boettke. But I think what to the first question on Buchanan and all these public choice scholars that develop all these tools, I would say that they are theorizing the here and now, right? So, and by that I mean that they are assuming we are in here, and so how from here we get to there. And so to that extent, I think that they will be more the Holcomb style. So they will put, if I have to put people in two boxes, I'll say that they will go to the generation type of story. So we have capitalism, and that's how capitalism gets distorted along the way because of the rent-seeking dynamics. So that is to the first question. In a sense, they were not thinking, or when they were theorizing about rent seeking, they were not probably thinking in terms of comparative systems. So in a sense, it's unfair to say that, because they were focusing on a microeconomic point, and maybe they were not even thinking about these is cronyism the beginning or analytical endpoint. So in a sense, it's not their fault. It's not, they were probably not thinking in those terms. But if I have to put them in two boxes, I would say yes, the degeneration type of story will fit them better. To the second question, the so what question is like what we learn out of this. So the first thing, and so that's how we end the paper actually, with a quote from Bernie Sanders where he says, we have to get rid of this system. Capitalism is done very wrong things to us. And so the first thing is understanding that cronyism arises from this entanglement, makes us rethink discretionary action, right? So if the entanglement and the fact that the state intervenes in the economy that allows or enhances cronyism makes you think that probably intervening more to try to get rid of cronyism is not a good solution, right? Because it's like throwing gasoline on fire, right? It's gonna exacerbate the problem. So that's to distinguish the people that want to tackle the cronyism with more intervention. I know that this doesn't distinguish Holcomb from Professor Wagner, and that's more of your question. I think one important thing that one important implication of these two views is rhetorical, and I think rhetoric matters here, right? So one, the Holcomb story somehow implies that capitalism is to blame, right? Because it's emerging from capitalism, and so when, in a sense, it ends up siding a little bit with the critics of capitalism, even if unintended. But to the extent that capitalism degenerates into these things, it ends up being that. And so for Professor Wagner, and if we are correct, the fact that the system is dominated by elites, it's not a surprise. It's tell me something new, right? We expect that. What we didn't expect was the great enrichment, for one, right? So the period where we curbed the elites was unexpected. That's the anomaly. And what we can do is just to limit the amount of power that they have. We can never, as Professor Wagner even in these comments said, conflict will always be there. So it's futile to try to get rid of this conflict of the elites. It will not happen. And so I think this rhetorical aspect matters. And I think the ideas point actually in this talk, Professor Wagner emphasized a lot ideas, and so makes me doubt a little bit that. But I think, yeah, actually, yeah, maybe on the ideas point, I think both will agree. So I think they are on the same page. Yeah. Is this any helpful, Niels? Yeah.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
So I'll jump in with a question. So like everyone else here, I've greatly enjoyed this paper. I think it's very fun. I think it sheds new light on, great questions. But one
Thank you.
thing that, and this probably doesn't fit into this paper, this might be the next paper, but you don't get into sort of the intensity of cronyism across, societies, governments, whatever defining unit you want to, call it, right? I mean, surely you would agree that North Korea and like New Zealand are different, right? And so how, if cronyism is sort of the baseline, why are different countries at different levels of cronyism, right? So I can accept everything in your paper, but there's nothing there. And that, again, next paper, don't shoehorn it in here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, no, that's a phenomenal question. In fact, is the question that I keep asking myself. Is like, we know, yeah, if we come to the conclusion that cronyism is the baseline, if all countries will be to a certain extent crony, now the next question, as you are saying, is like, okay, but the United States is not Colombia or something like that, or North
Mm.
Korea, right? So the level clearly is not the same. So the question is, why is it that some countries manage to, at some level, keep cronyism dynamics in check, and others fail to do so? So I absolutely like that question, and it's a question that has been on my mind, and it's something to be thinking to be taught for the future. Absolutely, yeah. If you have ideas on how to pursue that question, yeah, I'll be very happy to hear them because I have been thinking about it, and as of now, I have not come up with any very good idea to write a paper on it. I
Yeah.
must. But
Oh,
thank you very much for that comment. Yes.
yeah. Dick.
Yeah. Well, just one quick question in response to your point there, Dave, which I think would make a fascinating kind of research program, which is how it is that members of Congress get so wealthy, what the process is after they become in Congress. And I know you, Dave, used to do some work in Congress as an assistant there. But congressional jobs don't pay hugely. I guess a couple 100,000 a year now, or something like that. And yet, there's almost no that I heard of any kind of situation where someone got elected and left office poorer than when they entered. Now, there's probably, see, all of our equilibrium theories don't allow us to get at that. But there's got to be some interesting kinds of processes that you can relate to the kinds of legislation and regulation that get imposed, uh, knowledge that comes in of future legislation that gets into market purchases of securities. All this. I mean, there is just a huge incongruity of the fortunes of members of Congress uh, relative to the announced salaries that they're receiving that I think would make a fascinating kind of research project in entangled political
Yeah.
economy. And yeah, I think uh, pure capitalism has no cronyism, but human nature,
Yeah.
cronyism is very much uh, latent there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the other question I wanted to ask you about is how, so I accept the premise that cronyism is universal, right? I have no problem with that. But like different countries, you might also want to think about different levels of governance. So, I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, right? And specifically, I live in a city called East Grand Rapids because we're pretentious like that. And so, in East Grand Rapids, I suspect there's a lot less cronyism than there is in Grand Rapids, and there's a lot less than there is in Lansing, which is our state capital, and a lot less in Washington than in Washington, D.C., right? And so that speaks to, stuff that Wagner has said in other works about how close the ties are, the ties that bind really are. 535 people in Washington, D.C., they don't know Simple Dave, right? But like whatever my mayor's name is, whose name is escaping me, right? She used to be my neighbor. So like she knows me pretty well. And so how well or how closely connected, or in the philosophy literature, like the remote participation kind of idea,
Right.
right? How remote we are from our rulers, if you will, might also be a check on some of this. But again, another paper as you're finishing up your dissertation and going on the job market. So you're welcome,
Uh,
and I'm sorry.
no, that's fascinating, and truly, you are thinking the questions that were follow-ups of these. And so I actually, me and Professor Pete Boettke, we wrote another paper on that question. That the paper title is Crony Capitalism, Populism, and Democracy. And so the thesis of that paper is, okay, it's not democracy per se that leads to cronyism, is this democratic setting that leads to cronyism. And so we get precisely at these questions like, okay, what about democracy, or this current democratic setting is leading to cronyism? And we see rational ignorance, the fact that the feedback loops are long, and it's difficult to track exactly that. And so we go over some specific features of current democratic settings and say, okay, so now if we change this, right, crony dynamics might be curtailed. And so I think what you're saying, and the way I took it, is precisely that. So if we imagine more polycentric systems of governance, if we have something that Professor Wagner also talks about, this distinction between debate and discussion, for example, where people share a common goal instead of coalitions trying to win over the other. And so basically it's precisely that. So we try to reimagine. It's a little bit pretentious, I know, but we try to reimagine how a different democratic setting will at least curtail some of these crony dynamics that are generated. Polycentric governance. We also talk a little bit the constitutional constraints of Buchanan, but we in that paper, in that specific paper, we say that they are important, but they are not enough, because and this is a point that Professor Wagner again makes, that the rule of law has to be one, interpreted and enforced, and it's going to be interpreted by people, and it's going to be enforced by people. And so in the end you have the rule of man, not the rule of law. And so if you don't have other institutional settings that reinforce these constitutional constraints, by itself the constitutional constraints degenerate again into the chronism. And so yeah, absolutely, I thank you for that comment, because it's it's spot on, and it's literally a follow-up of these all these questions as you are getting at. Yes.
Let me make one quick remark. So this is
Please.
my one weakness of Buchanan, if I may, and maybe Dick will get mad at me, but I don't know. We'll find out together. My one criticism of Buchanan is that he seems to think that if you write something down on a piece of paper, it will be understood as the received or distilled wisdom of the past, and not as like a roadblock or a challenge that has to be surmounted. He never, as far as I'm aware, he never saw that distinction where, is this in the Affordable Care Act, for example, is this a tax or a penalty, right? And even in the tariff debate, right, is this a tax, or can I just impose a license fee to import and then get around the principle of Article 1 versus Article 2 separation of powers? Buchanan thought all that was crystal clear and
Yeah.
just went forward brilliantly, but that is an oversight, at least in my opinion, of Buchanan's work.
Yeah, I
But
share
we
that.
we have 5 minutes left, and I do want to let Ehsan speak as well.
Hello, André, and thank you for your great paper. One thing that Dr. Hebert discussed about came this idea to my mind, that do you think that if we can say, I'm not sure if the terminology and the word is correct and suitable or not, but can we say that we can define an optimal level of rent seeking or optimal level of cronyism as at least a policy analysis tool or even constitutional design tool. In the case that we believe cronyism is necessary, is the natural level, so we cannot get rid of it. So what if we can define such a thing, or do you think still that the best policy is the policy that we should make the cronyism less, or no, we can't say something like that optimal level, for example, by providing new rents to some other groups in order to change the system in maybe a better cronyism? Oh, I wanted to know your idea about this.
Thank you, Assam, for your question. Yeah, it's interesting because in the paper we assume that cronyism is something that should be minimized. We should reduce cronyism as much as possible. And some people I can see, in fact, there is a literature that's saying that cronyism, there are some levels that are optimal to get things around, like especially in societies where the rule of law is not strong. Cronyism might be a way to get things done, in a sense. So you're right to the extent that in the paper we assume that we should reduce crony dynamics as much as possible. And one thing that I also took from your question, I'm not sure if I'm not mistaken here, but you can let me know, is that what is the tipping point of a crony level, right? So what is the point where things really start to go wrong, is right? Okay, assuming that we have always to have cronyism, what is the point where things really go wrong? And honestly, I don't know the answer. I think no one knows the answer, but it's certainly something interesting to think about, right? Again, going back to the question that Dave mentioned before, it's like North Korea is not the same as the United States, even though if we follow this paper, we will both say that they are both chronic systems, but clearly not the same level of crony. So where exactly is the level where you get more similar to North Korea rather than the US? That I don't have an answer to it. I mean, it's something to think about, of course. And yeah, thank you for the comments. Really, I think it's a very good question that unfortunately I don't have the answer.
All right, we'll go to Dick with the last word or
Okay, well,
words.
this is Dave, was just in response to your point about Buchanan. And what I would say in that respect is, yeah, he did think that if you write it in paper, paper enforces itself rather than people with their interpretations doing it. But this, illustrates the theme of my earlier remarks that it's our models that make our thoughts, our channel, or give them shape. And so if you have a model that is susceptible to a simple maximization under constraints kind of framework, as happened to economics after 1870, here we are. That's why, and I see Meg is here now too. And, Meg and I just had this book on Reason, Ideology, and Democracy, I think we titled it, which, we're in that book, we're trying to advance a different kind of more evolutionary, uncertainty laden approach to social affairs. So Buchanan came out of Chicago in 1948. Oscar Longo was teaching at Chicago then. He was a big socialist maximizer. Buchanan learned standard welfare economics, and he gradually came to trying to break out of that mold, but his basic framework was optimization, equilibrium, and you can see that throughout most of his works, and he gradually started moving away from it probably in the 1980s or 90s or somewhere, but never wholly. But that's just a feature of all of us. we operate with certain schemes of thought that through which we organize what we see out there. And so that's one of the big virtues of entanglement as a scheme of thought, is it's trying to think of a way that's more compatible with how social life actually proceeds. And Meg, while I have the platform, I hope you're doing well. I know you've got surgery coming up here sometime or other. Maybe you've had it. I don't know. But anyway, good luck.
Thank you, Professor Wagner.
All right. Well, we are at time, so I do want to respect everyone's time and the schedule that we have. So please join me in thanking Andre for an excellent paper, and thank you all for just a fun conversation today.
Thank you very much for everyone that attended. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you, Professor Wagner. Thank you very much.
All right. And we'll see you all at the next month's meeting where we'll have another speaker come in.